I never thought a microphone could be a weapon. But as my son, Mark, tapped it, the soft thud echoed through the grand ballroom and struck me like a bullet to the chest. He stood on the polished dance floor, bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers I had paid for, his smile as bright and empty as the promises he'd once made. The air was thick with the scent of expensive roses and catered triumph of victory paid for with $19,000 of my life. My entire savings. Every penny I had tucked away for a leaky roof, for a medical emergency, for the dignity of my own funeral. All of it was here, shimmering in the crystal glasses and gleaming on the silk tablecloths of his perfect Dallas wedding. He raised a glass. "I'd like to thank someone truly special," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. I felt a familiar, foolish flutter in my heart. My hands, resting in the lap of my simple navy blue dress, clasped together. I had practiced my expression in the mirror for weeks, a serene, proud smile that didn't betray the bone-deep exhaustion of a 70-year-old woman who had given everything. The smile was fixed on my face now, a perfect, brittle mask. Then he turned, not to me, but to the head table. His arm extended, and he pointed directly at the woman seated beside my new daughter-in-law. "I want to thank my real mother," he declared, his voice ringing with an emotion he had never once shown me. "Mrs. Lawson." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shattered glass. 150 heads swiveled in unison, first toward Margaret Lawson, whose face was a mask of practiced, wealthy humility, and then, for a fleeting, curious moment, toward me. They saw exactly what they were meant to see. The quiet, unassuming retiree in the corner, a relic from a past life, smiling and nodding as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The applause that followed was a deafening wave of validation for a lie I had funded. It washed over me, a roar of noise that sounded like the ocean trying to pull me under. My smile didn't waver. Not by a millimeter. But inside my chest, my heart seized, a frantic, trapped bird beating against its cage. My real mother. The phrase echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of my mind. So, I was the unreal one. The placeholder. The woman good enough to raise him, to work double shifts until my bones ached, to sacrifice every dream I ever had for myself on the altar of his future. I was good enough to hand over the savings of a lifetime without a single question. But I was not real. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. I watched Margaret Lawson, a woman draped in diamonds and condescension, incline her head gracefully. She was the real one. The one with the Texas money, the multiple businesses, the lifestyle he and his new wife, Brittany, so desperately craved. The one who hadn't sacrificed a thing. The crowd saw a touching moment of family blending. I saw a corporate merger, and I was the asset that had just been liquidated. My son, the CEO of his new life, had just announced my redundancy to the shareholders. I reached for my water glass, my movements slow and deliberate. My hand was perfectly steady. It was a small miracle. Inside, I was trembling so violently I thought my teeth might shatter. The slice of wedding cake on the plate before me, a confection that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, suddenly looked obscene. I couldn't swallow, I couldn't breathe. All I could do was hold that smile. It wasn't a loud crash, it was a quiet, clean snap. The sound of a thread stretched taut over 70 years of sacrifice, of forgiveness, of endless, one-sided love finally giving way. The part of me that had always made excuses, that absorbed the small cruelties and the vast indifferences with a patient nod, that always whispered, "He's your son, he'll come around," went utterly silent. It didn't die in a blaze of anger, it simply ceased to exist. In its place, a chilling, absolute stillness took hold. The smile on my face was no longer a mask to hide the pain. It was a shield, cooling and hardening into something new. Something unbreakable. They thought I would absorb this, too. They thought I would sit quietly in my corner, invisible and irrelevant, and simply fade away. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The drive back to the hotel was silent. The rented sedan, another expense on a list I could no longer bear to contemplate, glided through the slick, rain-washed streets of Dallas. The city lights blurred into long streaks of indifferent color. I stared out the passenger window, my reflection a ghostly overlay against the metropolis. I saw a woman with a smile still etched onto her face, a rictus of social necessity that felt like it had been carved into bone. It was the same smile I had held through the rest of the reception, through the cutting of the cake, through the first dance where Mark spun Brittany under the lights, never once glancing my way. When I finally reached the solitude of my beige and brown hotel room, the smile dissolved. It didn't crumble, it simply vanished, as if it had never been. I unzipped the navy blue dress and let it fall to the floor in a heap. I stood before the full-length mirror in my sensible slip, looking at the woman staring back at me. 70 years old. Lines etched around my eyes and mouth, a map of worries and sleepless nights. My hands, gnarled slightly with arthritis, were the hands of a woman who had worked, not of a woman who had been cared for. They were the hands that had held a tiny, trembling 5-year-old boy for the very first time. His name was Mark, and he was a ghost of a boy when I met him. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's terrified eyes. They had been gone for a week, their lives extinguished in a mess of twisted metal on a highway somewhere in Indiana. I was 25 years old, working the assembly line at a plastics factory in Chicago, my life a predictable rhythm of the punch clock, the roar of machinery, and the greasy takeout I ate standing over my sink. I was his mother's distant cousin, the only family anyone could find who wasn't already overburdened or unwilling. I remember the social worker, a tired woman with a kind face, sitting across from me in my cramped apartment. "It's a lot to ask, Stephanie," she'd said, her voice gentle. "You're young, you have your whole life ahead of you." I looked at the small boy sitting on my worn sofa, his legs too short to touch the floor, his hands clutching a worn teddy bear. He hadn't spoken a word. He just watched, his eyes ancient with a grief no child should ever know. In that moment, my own life, the one of casual dating, of saving for a second-hand car, of maybe, someday, finding a man and having my own children, felt impossibly trivial. It was a flimsy dream that evaporated in the face of this raw, immediate need. I wasn't just adopting a child. I was making a promise to the memory of his parents, a promise to shield this small, broken soul from any more pain. "He'll stay with me," I said, and the words felt like the first truly real thing I had ever done. That promise reshaped my world. My life was no longer my own, it was a resource to be poured into his. The factory became more than a job, it was the engine that fueled his survival. I took every overtime shift offered, my days bleeding into nights. The roar of the machinery became the soundtrack to my life, a constant, churning scream that I still heard in my sleep. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, to pack his lunch before my own feet were steady on the floor, to check his homework with eyes burning from exhaustion. My coworkers, women who talked about their husbands and their weekend plans, eventually stopped asking me to join them for a drink after work. They knew the answer would always be the same. "I have to get home to Mark." Quote. There was a man once, a forklift operator named Dave, with kind eyes and a laugh that made me feel, for a fleeting moment, like the 27-year-old woman I was. He asked me out 3 times. The first 2 times, I couldn't find a babysitter. The third time, Mark came down with a fever, his small body shivering under the blankets. As I sat by his bedside, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth, I listened to the phone ring, knowing it was Dave. I let it ring. After that, he didn't ask again. The possibility of a life for myself, a life with a partner, became another quiet sacrifice, another road not taken. I told myself it didn't matter. Mark was my life. Vacations were postcards his friends sent from Disney World, taped to our refrigerator. New clothes were the school uniforms he needed, not the winter coat I did. My dreams became smaller, more focused. My dream was a good report card. My dream was seeing him score a goal in his soccer game. My dream was hearing him laugh. For those small moments, the crushing weight of the sacrifice felt manageable. It felt like love. The biggest sacrifice came when he was 12. He was smart, smarter than the other kids in our rough neighborhood school. I saw a spark in him, a potential that I knew would be extinguished by the tired, overcrowded classrooms and the gangs that loitered on the street corners. I saw an advertisement for a private academy, Oak Ridge Prep, with manicured lawns and a reputation for sending its graduates to top colleges. The tuition was a number so astronomical it seemed like a joke. It was more than half my annual salary. But I saw it as his only way out. His only path to a life better than the one I could provide. So I took a second job, cleaning offices downtown from 8 p.m. to midnight. For 6 years, my day started at 5 a.m. for the factory shift and ended after 1 a.m. When I finally fell into bed, the smell of industrial plastic and chemical cleaner clinging to my hair. I ate canned soup for dinner. I patched the patches on my work jeans. I sold my mother's old jewelry. And I made every single tuition payment on time. I would attend parent-teacher conferences at Oak Ridge feeling like an imposter. The other mothers were polished women with perfect hair and expensive handbags, talking about their ski trips to Aspen. I would sit there in my best, but still worn, blouse, my hands scrubbed raw but with a faint, permanent line of grease under the nails that never seemed to disappear. They were polite, but their eyes slid over me, dismissing me. I was not one of them. I was just the factory worker who, by some miracle, was funding her son's presence in their world. I endured their condescension because I believed I was giving Mark a key to a kingdom I could never enter, but one where he would belong. Now, standing in this sterile hotel room, the full, brutal irony of it all crashed down on me. I hadn't given him a key. I had given him a weapon. I had paid for him to learn the language of a class that would teach him to be ashamed of me. I had funded his education in the art of looking down on the very woman who made it all possible. The humiliation at the wedding wasn't a sudden betrayal, it was the culmination of a lifetime of my own foolish, blind devotion. I had made myself small so he could feel big. I had erased myself so he could write his own story. And in the end, he had written me out of it completely. I walked over to the window and stared down at the city lights. They were no longer a blur. They were sharp, cold, and distinct. Just like the truth. My sacrifices weren't gifts of love to him. They were transactions. I had paid for his childhood, his education, his comfort. I had paid for this wedding. And now, he saw me as nothing more than the bank that had funded his ascent. A bank whose vaults, he believed, were now empty. The part of me that had snapped at the reception wasn't breaking down. It was forging itself into something else in the cold silence of this room. Something hard. Something sharp. Something useful. The exhaustion of 50 years of labor, the lonely nights, the relinquished dreams. They weren't a source of sorrow anymore. They were a debt. A debt he didn't even know existed. And I, Stephanie Miller, the invisible woman, the unreal mother, was about to become the debt collector. The hotel room was a tomb, silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. I sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed, the stiff, impersonal comforter cold against my legs. The reflection in the darkened window showed a stooped, tired woman, but I wasn't seeing her. I was seeing another room, another time, another version of myself, a woman of 52, brimming with a nervous, hopeful love that now seemed like a grotesque caricature. The humiliation at the wedding hadn't been the first cut. It was merely the final, twisting of a knife that had been lodged in my heart for 18 years. Mark's words, my real mother, were not a new sentiment. They were just the first time he had said them in public. He had just turned 18. It was a Tuesday in October, crisp and smelling of impending winter. I'd taken the day off from the factory, a rare indulgence, to make his favorite meal, pot roast with roasted potatoes and carrots. For dessert, I'd baked a chocolate cake from scratch, the same one I'd made for him every year since he was 6. It sat on the kitchen counter of our small Chicago apartment, a single, proud candle waiting to be lit. The apartment was cramped, the furniture was worn, but that day it felt like a sanctuary. This was the culmination of my life's work. He was graduating from Oak Ridge Prep in the spring, with acceptance letters from 3 universities already on his dresser. He was a man now, and a man deserved the whole truth. I had kept the secret locked away for 13 years, a heavy, precious burden. I had promised the social worker I would tell him when the time was right, and to me, 18 felt right. It felt like the threshold where our relationship could evolve from one of protector and child to one of 2 adults, bound by honesty and a love that transcended biology. I rehearsed the words in my head all day, my stomach twisting into knots. I wanted to do it perfectly. I wanted him to see it not as a revelation of what he wasn't, but as a confirmation of what he was. Chosen. Loved. Wanted. He came home from school, dropped his backpack by the door with a familiar thud, and grunted a hello as he headed for the TV. The air was filled with the rich, savory smell of the pot roast, a smell that had always meant home. "Turn off the TV for a minute, honey," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I want to talk to you about something important." He sighed, the exaggerated, put-upon sigh of a teenager whose world has been unjustly interrupted, but he clicked the television off. The sudden silence in the room was immense. I brought the cake to the small kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I set it down between us. He looked at the cake, then at me, his expression impatient. "Mark," I began, my heart thudding against my ribs. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago. I wanted to wait until you were old enough to understand." I took a deep breath. "Your parents, the ones who gave birth to you, they loved you very much. They died in an accident when you were a little boy." My voice cracked on the last few words. "I'm not your birth mother, Mark. I adopted you. But I have loved you as my own son every single day since." I finished, my chest aching with the release of the long-held secret. I waited for the questions, the shock, maybe even the anger. I was prepared for tears. I was prepared to hold him, to reassure him, to spend the rest of the night talking through it all, reinforcing the unshakable truth that my love was real, that we were real. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He didn't look at me at all. His gaze drifted past me, toward the blank screen of the television. He shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture that negated my entire life's purpose. "I already knew," he said, his voice completely flat. He finally met my eyes, and there was no emotion in them at all, just a cool, indifferent assessment. "You're not my real mom." The air left my body in a silent rush. It was as if the floor had dropped away, leaving me suspended in a cold, airless void. The smells of pot roast and chocolate cake suddenly seemed cloying, sickening. The single candle on the cake looked pathetic, its tiny flame wavering in a world that had just gone dark. I had spent 13 years fearing this moment, and in my worst nightmares, I had never imagined a cruelty so simple, so absolute. It wasn't the knowledge that broke me, it was the casual dismissal. The fact that he already knew and had never said a word. He had watched me sacrifice, watched me work myself to the bone, all while holding this secret knowledge, this judgment, against me. How did you know?" I whispered, the words barely audible. "Found the papers in your dresser years ago," he said, his attention already drifting back to the remote control. "When I was looking for cash." I felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't been looking for a connection to his past. He had been looking for money. And in the process, he had found a truth that he had decided to weaponize through silence. The rest of the evening is a blur in my memory. I think we ate dinner. I think I cut the cake. But the conversation I had prepared for, the deep, heartfelt connection I had hoped for, never happened. An invisible wall had slammed down between us. A wall I had been too blind to see was being built for years. I was devastated, But a foolish, stubborn part of me still clung to hope. I told myself it was just the shock. He was a teenager. He would process it, and our bond, the one I had poured my entire existence into, would survive. It didn't. It died a slow, creeping death over the next few years. The wall between us grew higher, thicker, more impenetrable. He went off to college, the one I took on extra debt to pay for, and the distance became more than just geographical. The phone calls became shorter, more transactional. He stopped calling me Mom. At first, he just avoided any title, but then, in a call during his sophomore year, he referred to me as Stephanie to one of his friends in the background. The name felt alien in his mouth, a formal, sterile word that severed the last thread of our intimacy. After that, it was always Stephanie when he spoke of me, and soon, it was Stephanie when he spoke to me. When he came home for holidays, he was a visitor, a polite stranger in my home. He spent his time on his phone or out with his high school friends, who were now also learning to call me Stephanie. I would cook his favorite meals, and he would eat them while texting, his attention 1,000 miles away. The questions about his life were met with monosyllabic answers. The questions about mine were never asked. I tried to bridge the gap the only way I knew how, by being useful. I sent him care packages filled with his favorite snacks. I wired him money whenever he said he was short, which was often. Each transfer felt like a desperate offering, a plea for him to remember the boy who used to need me. But I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a service provider. An ATM. A remote-operated utility. And I was too afraid to turn off the machine, terrified that if the money stopped, the last, flimsy pretext for any connection at all would vanish. I told myself he was just growing up, finding his own way. I made excuses for his coldness, his distance, his casual disregard for my existence. It was easier to lie to myself than to face the cold, hard truth that sat at the bottom of my heart. He was ashamed of me. I was the working-class factory worker, a relic of a past he was desperate to escape. Now, sitting in the Dallas hotel room, the lie was finally dead. The excuses had turned to ash in my mouth. His words at the wedding were not a new wound, they were the salt poured into an old one. He hadn't just known I wasn't his real mom, he had been actively searching for a replacement. And in Margaret Lawson, with her oil money and her casual power, he had finally found one. He had found a mother he felt he deserved. The devastation I had felt on his 18th birthday was the grief of a mother who thought she had lost her son's affection. Tonight was different. Tonight was the cold, clarifying rage of a woman who realized she had been the victim of a long, elaborate con, a con she had willingly, lovingly, funded every step of the way. The hope that their bond would survive? That hope was a fool's dream. The bond had been a one-way street since the day he found those papers. I had been loving a memory, while he had been tolerating an obligation. And I was done being tolerated, done being a utility, done being unreal. The bond wouldn't survive. He was right about that. Because I was about to burn it to the ground. The anger that had settled in my hotel room wasn't hot. It was glacial. A cold, heavy mass that displaced all the grief and shock, leaving behind a terrifying clarity. As I sat there, the city of Dallas sleeping outside my window, I began to dissect the past not as a series of unfortunate emotional drifts, but as a calculated, strategic campaign. The public humiliation at the wedding was the victory parade. The war had started 3 years earlier, the day a woman named Brittany Lawson walked into my life. I was 67 then, retired for 2 years, living a quiet, predictable life on my Social Security and the small pension from the factory. My world was my apartment, my small garden plot, and the twice-weekly calls with Mark, which were already becoming more perfunctory. Then he called one Tuesday, his voice buzzing with a nervous energy I hadn't heard in years. "Steph, I'm bringing someone home for dinner this weekend," he'd said. "Her name is Brittany. She's really special." The use of the word home was a calculated piece of sentimentality, a word he hadn't used to describe my apartment in a decade. But I was so desperate for a sign of the old Mark that I didn't see the manipulation. I only felt a surge of foolish, maternal hope. I spent 3 days cleaning the apartment until it shone. I cooked for 2 straight days, preparing the same pot roast he'd once loved, foolishly believing the scent might reawaken some dormant piece of the boy I had raised. They arrived on Saturday evening. The moment I opened the door, I knew my world had tilted on its axis. Mark was there, but he seemed smaller, somehow, standing next to her. Brittany Lawson was not a girl, she was a finished product. She was tall and slender, dressed in a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks that probably cost more than my monthly rent. A delicate gold necklace rested on her collarbone, and the diamond studs in her ears were small but of a startling, brilliant quality. They glittered under the cheap incandescent bulb of my hallway. Her smile was perfect, a dazzling display of white, even teeth, but it never touched her eyes. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they were busy. They swept over my small living room, taking in the worn floral sofa, the scuffed coffee table, the framed photos of Mark's childhood that lined the walls. It wasn't a glance, it was an appraisal, an inventory. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, Stephanie," she said, extending a hand with long, manicured fingers. Her handshake was firm, cool, and brief. "Mark has told me so much about you." The way she said it implied that what he'd told her was a collection of quaint, slightly tragic anecdotes. Mark hovered behind her, a nervous courtier. "Britt, this is Stephanie," he stammered, the word mom dying on his lips before it could even form. Dinner was an exercise in quiet tension. Brittany moved her food around her plate, taking tiny, bird-like bites. She asked me questions that sounded polite on the surface but were designed to categorize and dismiss me. "So, you worked at a factory? For your whole life?" "How?" "Dedicated." She said dedicated the way one might describe a draft horse. I watched Mark watch her, his face a mask of anxious adoration. He laughed a little too loudly at her bland jokes. He rushed to refill her water glass. He was performing, desperate for her approval, and in his performance, he was erasing me, apologizing for my existence with every nervous gesture. The final, telling blow came as they were leaving. Brittany's eyes landed on the proudest photo on my wall. Mark, age 18, in his Oak Ridge Prep graduation gown, holding his diploma. I was standing beside him, my face beaming, my arm around his shoulders. "Oh, is that your prep school, Mark?" Brittany asked, a note of genuine surprise in her voice. "My daddy sent me to boarding school in Switzerland." She turned to me, her perfect smile back in place. "It's just so wonderful what a good education can do, isn't it? It can really help someone transcend their circumstances." Transcend. The word was a perfectly aimed dart. She wasn't just acknowledging his education, she was framing it as an escape. An escape from me. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to defend me, to defend us. To say that his circumstances were a home filled with love, not a prison he had to transcend. He said nothing. He just smiled weakly and squeezed her hand, a silent, willing accomplice. As I closed the door behind them, the smell of my pot roast felt like the scent of decay. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I hadn't just met my son's girlfriend. I had met his new commanding officer. The introduction to her mother, Margaret Lawson, came 6 months later. It was a command performance. Mark called and informed me that we were all having dinner at a steakhouse in downtown Dallas on his next visit. "Margaret is really looking forward to meeting you," he'd said, his tone making it clear that this was not a request. The restaurant was a world of dark wood, hushed whispers, and leather-bound menus the size of tombstones. I felt like I was wearing a costume in my best black dress, the one I saved for funerals and weddings. Margaret was already there when we arrived, holding court in a plush, semicircular booth. She was an older, more formidable version of her daughter. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her jewelry was larger, and her eyes held the same cool, assessing quality, but with an added layer of undisguised power. She owned, as Mark had proudly told me, a portfolio of commercial real estate and 2 logistics companies. She was not just wealthy, she was the source of wealth. She gave me the same brief, cool handshake Brittany had. "Stephanie," she said, her voice a low Texas drawl that was smooth as bourbon and just as sharp. "So good of you to join us." Her eyes did the same sweep Brittany's had, but where Brittany's was an appraisal of assets, Margaret's was a dismissal of liabilities. Her gaze flickered over my dress, my sensible shoes, my worn leather handbag. In 2 seconds, she had calculated my net worth and found it wanting. The dinner was Margaret's monologue, punctuated by Brittany's fawning agreement and Mark's sycophantic laughter. She talked about their recent trip to Paris, a new acquisition her company had made, the incompetence of the political class. My presence was an afterthought. She asked me one direct question all evening. "Mark tells me you're retired now," she said, peering at me over the rim of her wine glass. "What was it you did again?" "I worked in a factory," I said, my voice steady. "Plastics manufacturing." Margaret smiled, a slow, condescending curve of her lips. "How fascinating," she said. She turned to her daughter. "You see, Brittany? That's the American dream. Hard work. It's so important to have people who do that kind of work." She made it sound like I was a different species, a worker bee she was observing with detached, anthropological interest. She then looked back at me, her smile tightening. "You did a fine job with him, for what you had to work with. He's a smart boy. He just needed polishing." Polishing. The word hung there, over the half-eaten steaks and the ridiculously expensive wine. I was the rough stone. They were the jewelers who would cut and polish him into something worthy of their world. Mark, sitting right there, heard it. And he just beamed, taking it as a compliment. He was proud to be their project. From that day on, the wall between us became a fortress. The comparisons were constant, delivered by Mark in a casual, thoughtless stream that I now realize was carefully scripted by Brittany. "Margaret's portfolio manager is amazing. He says the market is all about." Brittany and I were in the Hamptons last weekend with her family's friends. You meet the most incredible people. We're thinking of buying a house, but Brittany says the starter homes in our area are what people like, well, you know, what other people buy. Other people. That's what I had become. My life wasn't a source of his stability anymore, it was a source of his shame. My small, tidy apartment was a liability. My social security check was a pittance. My sacrifices were no longer a testament to my love, but a marker of the lowly circumstances he had to transcend. I was the before picture. They were the after. Looking back now, from the cold clarity of this hotel room, I saw the whole 3-year arc. It was a methodical, relentless process of psychological demolition. They had isolated him, flattered his insecurities, and rewritten his history. They convinced him that my love was provincial and my sacrifices were an anchor holding him back. They taught him that real love wasn't about sacrifice, it was about acquisition. And the ultimate acquisition was a mother who matched his aspirations. The speech at the wedding wasn't an insult. It was a closing statement. It was the public announcement that the project of polishing Mark was complete. He had been successfully separated from his rough origins. I wasn't his mother. I was a circumstance he had finally, and with their generous help, overcome. And I, like a fool, had paid for the privilege of watching it happen. The campaign to erase me, which I now saw with such brutal, retroactive clarity, reached its apex 9 months before the wedding. The phone rang on a bleak Thursday afternoon in February. The sky outside my Chicago apartment was the color of dirty slush, and the wind howled with a familiar, mournful sound. I was mending a tear in my winter coat, a coat that was already 10 years old, trying to coax another season out of it. "Steph, you there?" Mark's voice came through the line, artificially bright and strained. "I'm here, Mark. Is everything okay?" My heart did its usual, stupid leap. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope he was calling just to talk, to ask how I was. Everything's amazing, he gushed. We set a date. We're getting married in November. In Dallas. Behind him, I could hear Brittany's voice, a faint, directing murmur. He was on speakerphone. I was on stage. That's wonderful news, honey, I said, my voice warm, a practiced, maternal sound I could produce on command. Yeah, and Britt and we've been talking. We want it to be perfect, you know? A day everyone will remember forever. He paused, and I could feel the gear shift in the conversation. This wasn't an announcement. It was a prelude. We found the most incredible venue, a historic hotel downtown, and Brittany's mother is handling the caterer. It's going to be a 5-course meal, with a string quartet during the cocktail hour. He went on, painting a picture of a fairy tale I had no place in. He spoke of imported orchids and a custom-designed cake and a photographer who had shot for a magazine. Each detail was a brushstroke in a masterpiece of extravagance, a world so removed from my patched coat and my cramped apartment that it felt like it was happening on another planet. I listened, my needle frozen in the fabric of my coat, a small, cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't a son sharing his joy. This was a salesman giving a pitch. It sounds beautiful, Mark. Truly, I managed to say. It will be, he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. I recognized the tone. It was the voice he used when he was about to ask for money. But, Steph, there's one part we're struggling with. The venue deposit and the down payments for the planner and the flowers. It's a lot, up front. Margaret is helping so much. But Brittany and we want a piece of it to be from our family, you know? From my side. We want you to be a part of making this day perfect. Gone. From my side. The words were a masterful piece of emotional blackmail. He was framing it as an opportunity for me to be represented, to have a stake in this grand new life he was building. He was offering me a chance to buy my relevance. I heard Brittany whisper something in the background. Mark cleared his throat. We were hoping, maybe you could help us out? To make it perfect? The cold knot in my stomach tightened. I knew, even before he said the number, that this would not be a small request. I had spent a lifetime anticipating his needs, and I could feel the shape of this one. It was large and sharp and final. How much do you need, Mark? I asked, my voice quiet. There was a moment's hesitation. Another faint whisper, and then he said it. $19,000. The number didn't register at first. It was an abstract figure, too large to connect to my reality. Then, slowly, the abstraction solidified into something terrifyingly concrete. $19,000. It was the exact, to the dollar, amount listed in the passbook for my emergency savings account. The account I had painstakingly fed for over 40 years, a few dollars at a time, from every paycheck. It wasn't an investment. It was a bulwark. It was the money for a new roof if the old one finally gave out. It was the money for a hospital stay that insurance wouldn't cover. It was the money I had set aside, with grim practicality, for my own funeral, so that my son wouldn't be burdened with the cost of burying me. He was asking for my security. He was asking for my dignity in sickness. He was asking for my peaceful death. Mark, I started, my voice failing me. That's everything I have. I know it's a lot, he said quickly, the practiced sincerity in his voice curdling into impatience. But this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, Steph. It's for my wedding. It's for my future. We'll pay you back, of course, down the line. I knew he wouldn't. The promise was a hollow courtesy, an insult to my intelligence. In his world, $19,000 was a deposit on flowers. In my world, it was the sum total of a life of denial. It was every movie I didn't see, every new dress I didn't buy, every vacation I never took. It was the ache in my teeth from a root canal I'd put off for 2 years. It was the rattling sound in my 10-year-old car that I pretended not to hear. Every small, daily sacrifice I had ever made was distilled into that single number. Please, Steph, he begged, his voice taking on a whining edge that was horribly familiar. It was the voice of the 5-year-old who wanted a new bike, the 16-year-old who needed a car. Don't you want me to be happy? I'm asking for your help. If you really loved me, you'd help me make this perfect. If you really loved me. The final, brutal turn of the screw. He was questioning the very foundation of my existence, the central, driving force of the last 45 years of my life. My love had never been a question. It had been an absolute, a physical law of my universe. And he was holding it hostage. A profound, soul-deep weariness washed over me. I was so tired of fighting, so tired of the endless, one-sided giving. A part of me, a small, rational voice that sounded a lot like my late father, screamed at me to say no. To tell him that my funeral was not for sale. To tell him that my security was more important than his string quartet. But another voice, a louder one, worn into a deep groove by decades of habit, whispered a different story. It whispered that this was the last time. This was my final offering. Maybe, just maybe, if I made this one last grand gesture, this one ultimate sacrifice, it would be enough. Maybe it would buy back a piece of the son I had lost. Maybe, if I helped him make his day perfect, he would remember the woman who had made his entire life possible. It was a fool's hope. A gambler's last, desperate throw of the dice. I knew it even as the words formed in my mouth. Okay, Mark, I said, the words tasting like ash. I'll send it. Dead. The relief in his voice was immediate and sickening. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Steph. You're a lifesaver. I knew I could count on you. He sounded like someone who had just successfully completed a difficult business transaction. Brittany's triumphant voice chirped in the background. Tell her we love her. We love you, he echoed, the words empty of all meaning. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment, the half-mended coat still in my lap. The love I felt wasn't warm. It was a cold, heavy obligation, a chain I had forged myself, link by painful link. The next morning, I went to the bank. It was a small, local branch where the tellers all knew my name. I slid my worn passbook, the one I kept in an old coffee can in my closet, across the counter to a young woman named Maria. I need to withdraw the full amount, I said, my voice a stranger's. And get a cashier's check made out to Mark Miller. Maria opened the book. Her eyes widened slightly as she saw the balance, then widened further at my request. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. The full amount, Mrs. Miller? Are you sure? This is a 30-year account. I'm sure, I said, my voice flat, leaving no room for argument. She processed the transaction in silence. I watched the numbers on her screen, the numbers that represented my life, vanish. She stamped the book paid in full and slid it back to me, along with the crisp, official-looking cashier's check. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the years of my life it represented. I walked to the post office in a daze and sent the check via certified mail. I didn't include a note, there was nothing left to say. 3 days later, I received a text message from Mark. Not a phone call. A text. Got it. Thanks. You are a lifesaver. That was it. My 40 years of careful saving, my security, my dignity, my funeral, reduced to a 7-word text message filled with abbreviations. There was no mention of love, no acknowledgement of the magnitude of the gift. I was a lifesaver, an inanimate object, a tool that had served its function. I stared at the text for a long time. The cold knot in my stomach began to transform. It was no longer just a feeling of dread. It was the first, slow crystallization of a truth I could no longer deny. I hadn't given my son a gift. I had paid a ransom. And I had just discovered, with chilling certainty, that there was no one left to save. I had given him everything I had. Out of love. No questions asked. And in return, he had given me an invitation to my own execution. The applause was a physical force. It beat against me, a wave of sound that threatened to knock the breath from my lungs. I sat at my small, designated table in the back of the ballroom, a solitary island in a sea of celebration. Each clap was a hammer blow, forging my practiced, serene smile into a mask of tempered steel. My son, Mark, stood on the stage, basking in the glow of the spotlight I had paid for, his arm now wrapped possessively around Brittany's waist. He was looking at Margaret Lawson, his expression one of pure, filial devotion, an expression I had starved for 18 years. An expression my $19,000 had just purchased for another woman. My real mother. The words did not just echo, they ricocheted inside my skull, shattering the last, fragile illusions I had harbored. I had told myself the money was a gift of love. I had told myself it was to ensure his happiness. But sitting there, amidst the splendor my life's savings had bought, I understood the brutal truth. I had not given a gift. I had funded my own replacement. I had paid, in full, for the public announcement of my own obsolescence. The ghosts of those $19,000 were everywhere in that room. They were in the towering floral arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas that cost more than my car. They were in the 6 tiers of the wedding cake, a monument of sugar and buttercream I would never taste. They were in the shimmering gold leaf script on the menus, in the heavy damask of the tablecloths, in the crisp, cold fizz of the champagne that filled the flutes of strangers. Every dollar had a story of a double shift, a patched coat, a lonely meal of canned soup. I had traded the quiet dignity of my past for this loud, garish monument to my irrelevance. The crowd, oblivious, continued to applaud. They saw a modern, blended family, a touching tribute. They didn't see the transaction. They didn't see a 70-year-old woman being declared emotionally bankrupt. My gaze drifted from Mark to the woman he had just crowned. Margaret Lawson accepted the tribute with the regal grace of a queen accepting what was rightfully hers. She inclined her head, a small, magnanimous gesture, and her diamond necklace caught the light, scattering brilliant, painful shards across the room. She was everything I was not: wealthy, powerful, polished. She was a mother a man like Mark could be proud of. I was the inconvenient truth he had spent his adult life trying to outrun. Then, I saw her move. She detached herself from the head table with a fluid, purposeful grace. A shark gliding through warm, shallow water. She handed her champagne flute to a passing waiter and began to navigate the tables, her progress a slow, deliberate march in my direction. The crowd parted for her. People smiled, they reached out to touch her arm. She was the center of this universe. As she drew closer, I could smell her perfume, an expensive, floral scent that smelled like power and contempt. She stopped in front of my table. She was taller than I was, even with me sitting, and she used the height to her advantage, looking down at me with an expression of perfectly calibrated pity. Her makeup was flawless, a porcelain mask that betrayed no genuine emotion. "Stephanie," she said, her voice the same smooth, condescending drawl I remembered from our dinner. "I just wanted to come over and say what a lovely thing Mark did. He has such a good heart." I kept the smile fixed on my face. It felt brittle, like thin ice stretched over a deep, dark chasm. I simply nodded, trusting that if I tried to speak, the only sound that would emerge would be a scream. She placed a hand on my shoulder. Her fingers were cold, and the weight of her rings pressed into my simple dress. It was not a gesture of comfort, it was a gesture of ownership. Of finality. "You did a great job raising him," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential, almost sympathetic murmur. Her eyes, however, were devoid of any such warmth. They were clear, cold, and triumphant. "We'll take it from here. We'll take it from here." There it was. The severance. The final, polite, brutal dismissal. It was the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head and a gold watch at the end of a long, thankless career. My job was done. My function had been served. I had delivered him, raised and educated, to their doorstep, and now my services were no longer required. The company was under new management. In that instant, something profound and irreversible happened inside me. The heartbreak didn't vanish, but it flash froze. The searing pain of Mark's betrayal, the dull ache of a lifetime of thankless sacrifice, the fresh, stinging humiliation of this public erasure, it all crystallized into a single, hard, cold point of light. The part of me that had wanted to weep, to crumble, to sink through the floor and disappear, died. It was replaced by a stillness so absolute it felt like a form of power. I looked up into Margaret Lawson's perfectly made-up face, and for the first time, I saw her not as a rival, but as an opponent. A foolishly overconfident one. She thought she was delivering the final blow. She thought she was speaking to a weak, sentimental old woman who could be dismissed with a few condescending words. She had no idea that she was not ending a story, but starting a war. My smile, the one that had been a shield for my pain, transformed. It was no longer a defense. It became a weapon. I let it broaden slightly, let it reach my eyes, hoping she would see not warmth, but the chilling glint of polished steel. "He is a wonderful boy," I said, my voice shockingly clear and steady. "I'm so glad he's found a family that can finally give him everything he believes he deserves." I put the faintest emphasis on the word believes. It was a subtlety she was too arrogant to catch. Her own smile widened. She had heard only what she wanted to hear, my capitulation. "Exactly," she said, squeezing my shoulder one last time before withdrawing her hand. "You just enjoy your evening." She turned and glided back toward the head table, her mission accomplished. I watched her go, a predator returning to its lair, satisfied with the kill. She thought she had won. She thought she had taken everything. She, and Mark, and Brittany, they all thought I was finished. They thought that by taking my money and my son, they had left me with nothing. How wrong they were. They had left me with the truth. A truth so stark and liberating it felt like a new kind of oxygen in my lungs. I was done being the quiet, long-suffering mother. I was done making myself small to accommodate their grand ambitions. I was done being grateful for the scraps of affection they threw my way. I was done being a footnote in my own life story. I was done being invisible. I picked up my champagne flute, the one paid for by my factory pension, and took a small, deliberate sip. The bubbles stung my tongue. It tasted like clarity. I looked across the room at the happy couple, now swaying on the dance floor. They looked beautiful. They looked happy. And they looked completely, utterly, vulnerable. They had built their perfect world on the foundation of my weakness, my silence, my unconditional love. They had no contingency plan for the day that foundation turned to stone. The music swelled, and the crowd of strangers applauded them again. This time, the sound didn't hurt. I barely heard it. I was too busy listening to the new, quiet, steady hum inside my own chest. It was the sound of an engine, cold for a long time, finally turning over. I was no longer a guest at my son's wedding. I was a ghost. And I was about to learn how to haunt. The flight back to Chicago was a 4-hour limbo. I sat by the window, watching the patchwork of the American heartland scroll by beneath me, a landscape as vast and indifferent as the emotional chasm that had just opened in my life. The plane was filled with the low murmur of conversations, the clink of ice in plastic cups, the banal sounds of a world moving on. I felt utterly detached, a spectator watching my own life from a great, unbridgeable distance. The cold, hard point of light that had formed in my chest during Margaret's condescending speech had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown steadier, a pilot light of pure, cold resolve in the wreckage of my heart. I took a cab from Midway, the familiar, gritty skyline of my city doing little to comfort me. When I finally stood before the door of my own apartment, the key felt strange in my hand. I unlocked the 3 deadbolts, a habit from 45 years of living alone in the city, and stepped inside. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, lingering scent of old books and lemon polish. It was the scent of my life, the one I had built alone. The silence I had once found so lonely now felt like a sanctuary. It was clean. It was honest. I dropped my small suitcase by the door. I didn't have the energy to unpack. I walked to the bedroom, took off the navy blue dress, the uniform of my humiliation, and, without folding it, stuffed it deep into a black garbage bag at the bottom of my closet. I never wanted to see it again. I put on my old, comfortable flannel robe, the fabric worn soft as a whisper, and went to the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, my movements slow and automatic. For the rest of that Sunday, I existed. I didn't live. I sat in my worn armchair, the one with the permanent imprint of my body, and stared out the window at the gray Chicago sky. The coffee in my mug grew cold. The phone remained silent. I expected nothing, and that, in itself, was a new kind of freedom. Hope, I was beginning to realize, had been a cage. For decades, I had been rattling its bars, begging for a response from a boy who had left the building long ago. Now, the door to the cage was open. The call came the next morning. Monday. I was rinsing my coffee cup in the sink when my phone, left on the kitchen counter, buzzed to life. The screen lit up with a picture of Mark and Brittany, smiling on a beach somewhere, their faces tanned and carefree. The photo had been a forced addition to my contacts, an update Brittany had insisted on during their last visit. It was a picture from their engagement trip to Hawaii, another vacation I had helped subsidize with a check for new tires for Mark's car. I dried my hands slowly, my heart rate remaining perfectly, unnervingly, steady. The desperate, hopeful flutter was gone. In its place was a clinical curiosity. I let it ring 3 more times before I answered, a small, petty assertion of control that was mine alone. "Hello," I said, my voice neutral. "Steph, hey, how was the flight?" Mark's voice was loud, tinny, and overlaid with the sound of seagulls and faint, crashing waves. He was in paradise. A paradise I had purchased. "It was fine," I said. Good. "Listen, you are not going to believe this place. The water is the color of, well, it's really blue," he said, his laugh strained. He was never good with details. "Brittany's mother, she really outdid herself. This resort is insane." I said nothing. I just stood in my quiet, gray kitchen, listening to the sounds of his new life. The silence stretched. I could feel his discomfort, his impatience. He was used to me filling the gaps, asking the questions, doing the emotional labor of our conversations. I was done. "Anyway," he finally continued, clearing his throat. "The reason I'm calling, something incredible has come up. A real opportunity. Margaret's realtor friend just called her. There's this house, this perfect little starter home in a great neighborhood just outside Dallas. It just went on the market, but it's a private listing. An inside track. It's a complete steal, but we'd have to move on it, like, now." The pilot light in my chest pulsed, a cold, steady beat. Here it was. The next transaction. So soon. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. He hadn't called to apologize for publicly disowning me. He hadn't called to thank me for the $19,000. He had called because the well had been refilled by his imagination, and he was here to drink again. "A house?" I repeated, my voice flat. "Yeah, it's perfect for us. 3 bedrooms, a big yard for a dog someday. It's the kind of place we could really start our lives, you know? The kind of place you'd be proud to visit." The lie was so bald, so shameless, it was almost impressive. He was dangling a fantasy of a future in which I was still welcome, a future he had no intention of allowing. "And what does this have to do with me, Mark?" I asked. His breezy tone faltered for the first time. A flicker of irritation. "Well, the down payment. We've got most of it covered, between our savings and what Margaret is chipping in, but we're just a little short to make a really strong offer. We need to show we're serious buyers." I leaned against the counter, the cool laminate a grounding presence against my back. "A little short," I echoed. "Yeah," he said, the impatience now clear in his voice. "I just need you to help us get over the finish line, just like with the wedding. You're so good at that. You're so good at that." The compliment was an insult of the highest order. I was good at being a resource. I was good at being liquidated. I took a slow, deliberate breath. This was it. The first word of the rest of my life. The first brick in a new wall. No, I said. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint cry of a distant seagull. He was processing a piece of data his system had never encountered before, a negative response. What? He finally stammered. What do you mean, no? I mean no, Mark, I said, my voice as calm and unyielding as a frozen lake. I can't help you. What do you mean you can't? He snapped, the charming honeymooner evaporating, replaced by the angry, petulant boy who had always gotten his way. Of course you can. You have your pension, you have your other accounts. Mark, I said, and for the first time, a sliver of ice entered my tone. There are no other accounts. There is nothing left. I gave you everything for the wedding. I am broke. The word, my new truth, hung in the air between Chicago and whatever five-star beach he was lounging on. He was silent for another moment, and then he laughed. A harsh, ugly, disbelieving sound. Oh, come on, Stephanie. Don't be so dramatic. You're not broke. You're just being, what, spiteful? Is this because of the toast? My God, it was a figure of speech. The rage that followed was a tidal wave. All the carefully constructed bonhomie, all the pretense of familial affection, was washed away, leaving only the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. After everything I've done for you? After everything Brittany and Margaret are doing for our family? You pick now to be selfish? You're going to let our dream house slip away over some stupid, perceived slight? His voice was rising, cracking with a fury that was both childish and terrifying. I remained silent. I had nothing to say. He was making my case for me more eloquently than I ever could. I am trying to build a life here, he shouted into the phone, his voice a raw, ugly tear in the fabric of the beautiful morning he was having. I am trying to make something of myself. And you're supposed to be my mother. You're supposed to help me. And then he delivered the killing blow. The one he had been sharpening his entire life. The one he knew had always worked. If you really loved me, he spat, the words venomous, you would find a way to help. The line went dead in my heart. He hadn't hung up, but the connection between us, the one I had spent 70 years nurturing, was severed. The pilot light in my chest didn't flicker. It bloomed into a cold, blue, efficient flame. I realized, in that moment, what I was to him. I was not a person. I was not a mother, real or otherwise. I was a machine. An automated teller machine. My function was to dispense cash upon request. My purpose was to fund his life. And now, the one time the machine had displayed the message insufficient funds, he was kicking it, cursing it, blaming it for failing in its sole function. He didn't see the woman who had filled the machine. He only saw the machine that had failed him. A lifetime of sacrifice, of love, of hope, all reduced to a malfunctioning appliance. I took the phone from my ear. His voice was still coming out of it, a tinny, distant stream of invective. I didn't listen. I calmly pressed the red end call button. I cut him off mid-tirade. That night, sleep did not come. I sat in my armchair, the city lights of Chicago twinkling outside my window. The rage had passed. The hurt had passed. All that was left was the cold, hard, beautiful clarity of the truth. He saw me as an ATM. Fine. An ATM has a security system. An ATM has records of every transaction. An ATM is connected to a bank, a powerful institution with rules and consequences. He thought the machine was empty. He had no idea about the bank. I vowed, in the silent darkness of my apartment, that things were about to change. The account of Stephanie Miller was no longer open for withdrawals. From now on, it was only open for accounting, and I was about to conduct a full, unforgiving audit of the last 45 years. The decision, once made, settled in my bones with the weight and permanence of granite. For the first time in days, I slept. It was not a peaceful sleep, but a deep, dreamless plunge into oblivion. I awoke just before dawn, not to the familiar ache of anxiety, but to a profound and unnerving sense of purpose. The city was still asleep, bathed in the gray, pre-dawn light. I made my coffee, my movements no longer slow and automatic, but crisp and efficient. The audit had begun. At the back of my bedroom closet, behind a stack of old blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme, was a small, locked metal box. It was heavy, unassuming, and covered in a thin layer of dust. I hadn't opened it in nearly 20 years. It was my father's. He had been a quiet man, a postal worker who believed in two things with an almost religious fervor: the United States government and the enduring value of Chicago brick. He'd worked his route for 40 years, never missing a day, and every spare dollar he had was invested with a slow, patient, methodical discipline that I had never possessed. When he died, he left me not with a speech about his love, but with this box and a single, gruff instruction. "Don't be a fool with this, Stephanie. It's for your old age." I had been a fool, but not in the way he'd feared. I hadn't squandered it. I had forgotten it. In the all-consuming vortex of raising Mark, of funding his every need and dream, this inheritance, this final gift from my father, had become a relic. I had tucked it away, telling myself it was a sacred trust, a safety net for a future so distant it felt unreal. My immediate reality had always been Mark, his tuition, his clothes, his endless, unforeseen emergencies. The $19,000 I had given him was my money, scraped together from my own labor. This box was different. This was my father's legacy, and I had a sudden, chilling realization that if Mark had known about it, he would have come for it, too. I retrieved the key from the back of my jewelry box, a small, ornate silver key that felt cold to the touch. The lock on the box was stiff. It clicked open with a loud, protesting snap, like a joint that hadn't been moved in years. I lifted the lid. The air inside smelled of old paper and my father's faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco. It was filled to the brim with documents, each one neatly filed in a manila folder, labeled in his precise, blocky handwriting. I took the box to the kitchen table. The same table where I had told Mark the truth about his adoption, and I began my work. It was a journey back in time, a conversation with a man long dead who had, it turned in, provided for me in ways I had never fully understood. The first folder was labeled Deeds. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic sleeves, were the titles to 3 properties. Not grand estates, but the kind of solid, unglamorous real estate my father had trusted. There was a 2-flat apartment building in Logan Square, a neighborhood that had been working class when he bought it in the 72nds and was now, I vaguely knew, trendy and expensive. There was a small, single-family bungalow in Oak Park, and, to my astonishment, there was the deed to a penthouse condo in a building on Lakeshore Drive, overlooking the vast, gray expanse of Lake Michigan. He'd bought it in the early 82nds during a market downturn, a piece of foresight that stunned me. The properties had been managed for the past 2 decades by my father's old lawyer, a man I had continued to pay a yearly retainer to, more out of habit and respect for my father's wishes than anything else. The rental income had been automatically deposited into an account I had never touched, an account I had simply allowed to grow, a forgotten river of money flowing silently beneath the surface of my life. The second folder was labeled Investments. It was filled with stock certificates and bond statements. My father had never trusted the whims of the stock market, but he had trusted American industry. There were shares in companies like Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson, solid, unexciting blue-chip stocks bought decades ago, their value having compounded silently, relentlessly, year after year. More significant were the municipal bonds. He had purchased them with the same steady discipline he'd applied to everything else. They were safe, they were tax-free, and they had been maturing and reinvesting for 30 years. The final folder was insurance. Inside was a single, thick life insurance policy. It was not on his life, but on my mother's. She had died when I was 20. He had taken the payout and, instead of spending it, had placed it in a single premium annuity, a financial instrument I barely understood. He had let it sit, untouched, for half a century. I spread the documents across my kitchen table. The morning sun was now streaming through the window, illuminating the faded ink and the crisp, legal language. I sat there, stunned into silence. I had spent the last 45 years of my life believing I was a woman of modest means, a factory worker living on the edge of financial precarity. I had patched my coats and worried about the cost of groceries. I had handed over my entire life's savings, the money I had bled for, believing it was all I had. It was a lie. I was not a woman of modest means. I was wealthy. I didn't have a precise number, but as I looked at the property deeds in now valuable neighborhoods, the thick stacks of bond statements, the sheer, quiet weight of my father's prudence, I knew the truth. The $19,000 that had felt like my entire world was, in the grand scheme of things, a pittance. A rounding error. I had given it to Mark not because I had to, but because I had allowed myself to believe that was all I was worth. The cold flame in my chest burned brighter, cleaner. The sense of purpose intensified. My father hadn't just left me money. He had left me tools. He had left me weapons. And he had left me his final unspoken instruction. Don't be a fool. I had been a fool for my son. I would not be a fool for myself. By 9 a.m., I was on the phone. My first call was to Robert Mitchell, the son of my father's lawyer, who had taken over the practice. He was a kind, serious man in his late 50s who had always treated me with a gentle, slightly baffled respect. "Robert, it's Stephanie Miller," I said, my voice devoid of its usual, slightly apologetic tone. "Stephanie, how are you? I trust the wedding was lovely?" he asked, his voice warm. "The wedding was very clarifying," I said. "Robert, I need to see you. Today, if possible. I want a full, updated valuation of all the assets your firm manages for me. The properties, the investment accounts, everything. And I need to make some immediate and significant changes to my will." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his methodical, legal mind. He had been sending me tidy, summarized statements for years, statements I now realized I had barely glanced at. He knew exactly what I was worth. He had probably spent the last 20 years wondering when I would wake up. "Of course, Stephanie," he said, his voice now carefully neutral. "Would 3 o'clock this afternoon work for you?" It would. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long moment, the documents spread before me like a battle map. The sense of betrayal from Mark's call, the raw humiliation of the wedding, it was all still there, but it was no longer just a wound. It was fuel. He had called me broke. He had called me selfish. He had judged me and found me wanting, based on the pathetic contents of my passbook account. He had no idea who I was. He had no idea who my father was. He had built his entire identity on the idea that he was transcending my small, impoverished life. The irony was so profound it was almost comical. He had hitched his wagon to Margaret Lawson's Texas money, believing it was his ticket out, his path to a bigger world. All along, the real fortune, the quiet, solid, generational wealth, was sitting in a dusty metal box in the back of a closet in Chicago, tended to by the woman he had discarded. I gathered the papers, my movements precise. I found the last will and testament I had signed 10 years ago. It was a simple document. It left everything, without condition, to my beloved son, Mark Miller. I took a black felt-tip pen from the junk drawer in my kitchen. With a single, steady stroke, I drew a line through his name. The black ink was stark and final against the page. It was not a legal act, not yet. But it was a declaration of independence. I then picked up the phone again. My second call was to a local nonprofit I had read about a few years ago, an organization that provided support, counseling, and financial aid to single, working-class women who had chosen to adopt. They helped women like me, women who had given up everything for a child who was not their own. I would need their information for Robert. The audit was over. The redistribution was about to begin. Mark wanted a mother he deserved. Fine. I would become the benefactor to mothers who deserved better sons. The 3 weeks that followed my meeting with Robert Mitchell were a quiet, methodical revolution. While Mark and Brittany were sending out glossy, professionally printed thank you cards for their perfect wedding, I was dismantling the life they thought they knew. While they were browsing for furniture for a house they could no longer afford, I was liquidating bonds and restructuring trusts. My days were spent not in my worn armchair, but in Robert's quiet, wood-paneled office, a place that quickly became my new command center. Robert, a man whose professional demeanor was as solid as the oak desk he sat behind, never once questioned my motives. He simply executed my instructions with a quiet, almost imperceptible air of satisfaction. He presented me with the full valuation of my father's legacy, a number that was even larger than I had imagined. With the booming Chicago real estate market, the properties alone were worth a small fortune. The final figure was just north of $900,000, a sum so vast it felt like it belonged to someone else. For a day, I was numb. Then, I understood, it did belong to someone else. It belonged to the new Stephanie. The one who was done being a doormat. My first move was logistical. The 2-flat in Logan Square and the bungalow in Oak Park were profitable rentals, and I left them under the management firm's care. But the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, that was different. It had sat vacant for 2 decades, a ghost apartment my father had bought as an investment, its furniture shrouded in white sheets like sleeping giants. Robert's firm had kept it clean, maintained the utilities, but no one had lived there since my father had signed the papers. It was time to wake it up. I gave the management company 1 month's notice to vacate my old apartment, the one in the walk-up building that Mark had always been faintly ashamed of. I hired a service to pack the few sentimental things I wanted to keep: my mother's china, my father's armchair, a box of Mark's childhood drawings that I couldn't yet bring myself to throw away. The rest of it: the worn floral sofa, the scuffed coffee table, the bed I had slept in for 30 years. I had them donate to a shelter for domestic abuse survivors. I was, in my own way, a survivor. It felt fitting. The day I moved was gray and overcast, the Chicago sky a familiar sheet of metal. But as the elevator ascended to the top floor of the Lakeshore Drive building, and the doors opened directly into my new home, I felt the sun break through inside my own chest. The apartment was vast. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the churning, steel-blue water of Lake Michigan. The view was endless, a horizon of possibility. The movers, looking slightly intimidated, placed my father's old armchair in a corner by the window. It looked small and humble against the scale of the room, a relic from another life. My life. I sat in it, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a seat of sorrow. It felt like a throne. For the next 2 weeks, I remade the space. I hired decorators. I bought furniture: sleek, modern pieces in shades of cream and charcoal and deep marine blue. I bought art, real art, from a gallery in the West Loop. I filled the closets with clothes made of cashmere and silk, fabrics my skin had never known. Every purchase was a quiet act of rebellion. I was not just decorating an apartment, I was building a fortress. A beautiful, luxurious, impenetrable fortress. The call from Mark came exactly 1 month and 2 days after the disastrous honeymoon conversation. I had been expecting it. My old landlord would have told him the apartment was empty, that I had left no forwarding address. He would be confused. He might even be, for the first time in his life, worried not for my well-being, but for the sudden, unexplained disappearance of his primary asset. I was sitting on my new velvet sofa, sipping a glass of expensive French wine, a Sancerre the man at the wine shop had recommended, and watching the city lights begin to glitter across the lake. The phone buzzed on the marble-topped table beside me. His name flashed on the screen. I let it ring, savoring the small, delicious moment of power. On the fifth ring, I answered. "Hello, Mark," I said, my voice calm, the single glass of wine having smoothed away any lingering ragged edges. "Stephanie, where are you?" His voice was tight, a string wound too taut. There was no greeting, no preamble. Just the raw, anxious demand. "I called your old number, it's been disconnected. I went by your apartment. The landlord said you moved out. What the hell is going on?" "I moved," I said simply. "You moved? You moved and you didn't tell me? Where did you go? Are you in some kind of state-run facility? Did you run out of money completely?" The questions tumbled out, a cascade of self-serving panic. He wasn't worried I was hurt. He was worried I had become a problem he would have to solve, a financial burden he would have to bear. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. "I assure you, I am not in a facility," I said, taking a slow sip of my wine. I swirled the pale gold liquid in the glass, watching it catch the light from the new chandelier I had installed. "And my financial situation is my own concern." "Your own concern?" he shot back, his voice rising in disbelief. "Everything you do is my concern. I'm your son. I have a right to know where you are, if you're safe." The hypocrisy was a physical blow. He hadn't cared if I was safe when he was draining my savings. He hadn't cared about my rights when he publicly humiliated me. He was invoking the word son now because his property had gone missing, and he was panicking. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment to deploy the new reality. "Mark," I said, my voice dropping, becoming as cool and clear as the glass in my hand. "It was you, at your wedding, who stood up in front of 200 people and clarified our relationship for me. You pointed to Margaret Lawson and you called her your real mother. It was a very public and very clear statement." I paused, letting the words sink in. I could hear his breathing, sharp and ragged, on the other end of the line. "So," I continued, my voice utterly serene, "since I am not your real mother, my address, my finances, and my life, should no longer be of any concern to you." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was a silence born not of indifference, but of pure, unadulterated shock. The rules of his universe had just been fundamentally rewritten, and he was reeling, unable to process the new physics of it all. I had taken his own cruel words and forged them into a shield he could not penetrate. "That's not, you can't be serious," he finally stammered. "I have never been more serious in my life," I said. And then, because I could not resist the final, perfect twist of the knife, I added, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests arriving. Goodbye, Mark." I ended the call. My hand was perfectly steady. My heart was calm. I had not shouted. I had not cried. I had simply stated the new terms and conditions. The contract of my unconditional, one-sided love had been officially, irrevocably, terminated. Of course, I had no guests arriving. My only companion was the vast, darkening lake and the deep, abiding satisfaction of a battle well fought. It took them 3 days to find me. I have no doubt Margaret put one of her corporate investigators on it. On a Saturday afternoon, my building's doorman buzzed up. "Mrs. Miller? There is a Mark Miller, a Brittany Lawson, and a Margaret Lawson here to see you. They say it's a family emergency." "It's not an emergency, George," I said into the intercom. "But please, send them up." I buzzed them in and then walked to my front door, opening it wide. I stood there, waiting, framed in the doorway of my new life. They stepped out of the elevator, their faces a perfect tableau of disbelief. Mark looked pale and shaken. Brittany's perfectly applied makeup could not hide the angry, confused set of her jaw. Margaret, for the first time since I had met her, looked genuinely thrown. Her cold, assessing eyes swept over the marble entryway, the modern art on the walls, the vast, light-filled space that stretched out behind me, all the way to the stunning view of the lake. This was not the shabby, working-class apartment of the woman they had dismissed. This was a citadel of wealth. A world they recognized. A world they had not known I possessed. Their shock was a sweet, potent balm on the raw wound of my humiliation. They had come here expecting to find me in some sad, subsidized apartment, a pathetic old woman they would have to scold and then manage. They had walked into a palace, and I was the queen on the throne. Brittany was the first to find her voice, her tone a sickly sweet concoction of false concern. Stephanie, oh, my goodness, we were so worried. What is all this? Did you win the lottery? Something like that, I said, my voice cool. I stepped back, gesturing them inside with a sweep of my hand. Please, come in. We have a great deal to discuss. They walked into my living room, their movements hesitant, like invaders uncertain of the terrain. They looked at my new furniture, my new clothes, the quiet, understated evidence of a fortune they had never suspected. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, so seismically, that the air in the room crackled with it. They were no longer the wealthy benefactors visiting the poor relation. They were supplicants, confused and angry, standing in a world they did not control. And I had never felt so beautifully, wonderfully, terrifyingly alive. I did not offer them a seat. I let them stand in the center of my living room, a small, bewildered flock of predators suddenly finding themselves in the wrong territory. They looked profoundly out of place amidst the clean lines and quiet luxury of my new life. Mark's eyes darted around the room, a frantic, desperate calculation happening behind them. He was trying to reconcile the woman who had mended her own coat with the woman who owned a sprawling penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The equation refused to balance. Brittany stood stiffly, her arms crossed, a silent, simmering fury radiating from her. Her appraisal of my apartment was no longer one of condescension, but of covetous disbelief. It was Margaret, always the strategist, who recovered first. She smoothed the front of her tailored silk blouse and manufactured a warm, conciliatory smile. It was a smile I recognized. It was the smile of a negotiator, a closer, a woman accustomed to getting her way through a carefully calibrated performance of reason and charm. Stephanie, my dear, she began, her Texas drawl softening, becoming almost motherly. It seems we've all had a bit of a shock. Clearly, we've misunderstood your situation. Why on earth didn't you tell us you were so comfortable? The word comfortable was a masterpiece of understatement. She was testing the waters, trying to reframe my hidden wealth not as a secret, but as a simple, girlish eccentricity. I walked past them to the wall of windows, my back to them for a moment as I looked out at the vast, endless gray of the lake. The view gave me strength. It was a view of pure, untroubled space. I turned to face them, my expression calm, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I was no longer the hunched, apologetic woman from the wedding. In my own home, surrounded by the quiet armor of my father's legacy, I felt 10 feet tall. You didn't know because it was none of your business, Margaret, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. You, and Brittany, and Mark, have made a great many assumptions about me. You assumed I was poor. You assumed I was weak. You assumed I was a limitless resource for you to exploit and then discard. Every single one of your assumptions was wrong. Hi. I let my gaze settle on Mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He was finally beginning to understand the scale of his miscalculation. Mark, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, not with affection, but with a clinical precision. You came here because you were worried your ATM had gone offline. You can relax. The bank it's connected to is far more solvent than you ever imagined. However, your withdrawal privileges have been permanently revoked. Go on. I gestured to the sleek, glass-topped coffee table. On it sat a single, thick manila folder. It was a copy of the new last will and testament I had signed in Robert Mitchell's office. I've had my lawyer rewrite my will, I stated, the words simple, clean, and devastating. Everything, the properties, the investments, the trusts my father left me has been placed into a new trust. Upon my death, The entire estate will be transferred to a charitable foundation I have established. I paused, letting them absorb the full impact. It's a foundation to support single, adoptive mothers. Women like me. The estate is quite substantial. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. It was like throwing a stone into a nest of vipers. Mark took a step forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of pleading. "No, Steph, Mom, you can't," he stammered, the word mom clawing its way out of him, a desperate, pathetic resurrection. "That's my inheritance. That's my future. You can't just give it away to strangers." "They are not strangers, Mark," I corrected him gently. "They are women who understand the meaning of sacrifice. And it is not your inheritance. It was never yours. It was a gift I intended to give you. A gift you proved, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that you do not deserve." Brittany, her composure finally shattering, erupted. Her voice was shrill, ugly. "This is because of me, isn't it? You're doing this to punish him because you don't like me." She pivoted to Mark, her face contorted with a theatrical, self-flagellating sorrow. "Oh Mark, darling, I'm so sorry," she cried, clutching his arm. "This is all my fault. I should have tried harder with her. I should have known she was this sensitive." It was a masterful performance. In one move, she had absolved herself of all guilt, painted me as a vindictive, overly sensitive old woman, and repositioned herself as the blameless, loving wife. But the performance was for an audience of one, and he was no longer the sole director of this play. I laughed. It was not a happy sound, it was a short, sharp bark of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Oh, Brittany, please," I said, my voice dripping with an icy disdain I didn't know I possessed. "Stop. You are not an actress, and I am no longer your audience. This has nothing to do with whether I like you. I neither like nor dislike you. To me, you are simply a predator who found a weak and willing target. This has to do with your actions, and his." My gaze returned to Mark. His face was a wreck of confusion and despair. He looked like a lost little boy, the same lost little boy I had taken into my home 65 years ago. For a fleeting, painful second, the old instincts flared the urge to comfort him, to soothe his pain, to make it all better. I ruthlessly extinguished it. That boy was a ghost. The man standing before me was a stranger who had disowned me. It was Margaret who stepped in, her voice a low, dangerous purr. The charming negotiator was gone, replaced by the ruthless CEO. "Now, Stephanie, let's not be hasty," she said, taking a step closer. She was trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me, a tactic that might have worked in a corporate boardroom, but not here. Not in my home. "You're emotional, that's understandable. But you're talking about undoing a lifetime of love over one silly, misguided comment at a wedding. You're punishing your only son. Think of the legacy. Think of your grandchildren." "My grandchildren?" I repeated the words, my voice laced with disbelief. "The hypothetical children of a man who sees his mother as a line of credit? The hypothetical heirs to a woman he publicly disowned? No, Margaret. I am thinking of my legacy. For the first time, I am thinking very clearly about it. My legacy will not be to enable a spineless, greedy man who was taught by his wife and his mother-in-law that love is a commodity to be bought and sold. My legacy will be one of strength. It will be a testament to the fact that a woman's kindness is not a weakness to be exploited." I let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy. I had laid my terms on the table. The consequences were declared. Mark finally broke, the last vestiges of his pride crumbling into dust. Tears welled in his eyes, real tears, I thought with a detached sense of pity. The tears of a man who has just seen his winning lottery ticket go up in flames. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. I was an idiot. It was a stupid, terrible thing to say, I didn't mean it. I was just trying to impress them." He gestured helplessly at his wife and mother-in-law, a tacit admission of the very weakness I had just named. Tell me what I have to do. I'll do anything to fix this. The air in the room shifted. Brittany and Margaret went still. This was the moment. The negotiation. They thought the door was opening, that my resolve was cracking, that a deal could be struck. I looked at my son, at the tears streaming down his face, and I felt nothing. The well of my maternal sympathy had run completely, irrevocably, dry. But I saw an opportunity. Not for reconciliation, but for justice. This isn't revenge, Mark, I said, my voice quiet, forcing them to lean in, to listen closely. This is justice. And justice requires restitution. Guan. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the folder. I held it in my hands. You want a chance to fix this? I asked. Fine, there is one condition. One path back to being considered a potential heir in my estate. Mark's head snapped up, a desperate, drowning hope in his eyes. Anything, he breathed. Your humiliation of me was public, I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble under their feet. Therefore, your apology must also be public. I want you to make a video. In it, you will look into the camera, and you will tell the world exactly what you did. You will say that you stood up at your own wedding and publicly thanked your mother-in-law as your real mother, deliberately and cruelly insulting the woman who adopted you, who raised you, who sacrificed everything for you. You will confess that you then had the audacity to call her from your honeymoon to demand more money. You will state, unequivocally, that you have treated me not as a mother, but as a bank. You will apologize, sincerely and without reservation. And then you will post that video online. On Facebook. On YouTube. For all your friends, for all of Margaret's business associates, for the entire world to see. I finished, the silence in the room so absolute I could hear the faint ticking of the new grandfather clock in the hall. The blood drained from Mark's face. The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a stark, horrified shame. Brittany let out a small, strangled gasp. Margaret's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. A public apology? A confession? It was unthinkable. It would be a social and professional catastrophe. You want me to destroy my life? Mark whispered, his voice trembling. My reputation? My career? You seem to be under the impression that those things are more important than my dignity, I replied, my voice devoid of all emotion. You had no problem destroying my heart in a room full of people. All I am asking is for you to repair the damage in the same public square. The choice is yours, Mark. Your pride, or your inheritance. You have 1 week to decide. I placed the folder back on the table. The meeting was over. I had stated my terms. The consequences were now in their hands. The ball was in their court, a ticking time bomb of their own making. And I had a feeling I already knew which choice a coward like my son would make. The silence in the penthouse after they left was the most profound peace I had ever known. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of sovereignty. I had laid down the law in my own kingdom, and the intruders had been repelled, leaving behind nothing but the faint, cloying scent of Margaret's perfume, an odor I promptly banished by opening the large sliding doors to the balcony. The cool, clean air of Lake Michigan rushed in, washing the space clean. I did not spend the next week anxiously awaiting Mark's decision. I did not sit by the phone, wringing my hands. The woman who would have done that was gone, a ghost left behind in my old, cramped apartment. Instead, I lived. For the first time, without the crushing weight of my son's needs and expectations, I truly, fully, lived. My ultimatum had been a test. Not a test of his love for me. I knew, with absolute certainty, that no such love existed. It was a test of his character, a simple, brutal equation I had laid before him. Was his greed more powerful than his pride? I had made the demand for a public apology knowing it was the one thing his carefully constructed, fragile ego could not withstand. Humiliating me in a ballroom full of cheering supporters had been an act of power. Humiliating himself in the cold, unforgiving light of the internet would be an act of utter self-annihilation. He had built his entire adult life on the foundation of Margaret's approval and the upwardly mobile world she represented. To publicly confess his sins against his poor, working-class adoptive mother would be to demolish that foundation. It would expose him as weak, ungrateful, and worst of all, in their world common. As I suspected, Mark refused. The official refusal came not from him, but from Margaret. It was delivered via a sterile, formal letter from her corporate attorney 3 days later. The letter was a masterpiece of legalistic threats and veiled insults. It spoke of my clear emotional distress and potential cognitive decline. It suggested that my actions constituted elder abuse and undue influence from unnamed outside parties. It warned me that any attempt to coerce Mark into a defamatory public statement would be met with swift and aggressive legal action. It was a declaration of war, signed not by a mother-in-law, but by a hostile corporation. I read the letter once, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. It was exactly what I had expected. They were doubling down on their arrogance. They believed my wealth, whatever its source, was a fluke, and that I was still the same pliable, easily intimidated woman they had always known. They thought they could bully me into submission. I handed the letter to Robert Mitchell, who chuckled as he read it. "They're panicking, Stephanie," he said, his voice laced with satisfaction. "This is the first volley from a very frightened enemy. They're trying to scare you back into your box." "There is no box anymore, Robert," I said. "I'm aware," he replied. "I'll draft a response that will, in the politest possible terms, inform them that we are not concerned." So, the meeting was ended. The one condition I had offered was rejected. And as I walked out of Robert's office that afternoon into the bright Chicago sunshine, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in decades. The final, fraying thread of obligation had been cut. I was completely, gloriously, free. I decided to celebrate. I had spent 70 years of my life living practically. My purchases were based on need, on durability, on budget. Now, for the first time, I wanted to buy something utterly, beautifully, useless. I wanted to buy something for no other reason than that I desired it. I walked down Michigan Avenue, the famed Magnificent Mile, a street I had only ever traversed as a hurried pedestrian, never as a customer. The windows of the luxury boutiques Cartier, Tiffany, Bulgari glittered like treasure chests. In my old life, I would have walked past without a second glance, acutely aware that a single item inside cost more than I made in 6 months. Today, I stopped. I saw it in the window of a private, appointment-only jeweler whose name I didn't even recognize. It wasn't a large piece, but it was breathtaking. It was a diamond necklace, a single, flawless, pear-shaped diamond of about 10 carats, suspended from a delicate platinum chain. It wasn't loud or ostentatious. It was simple, elegant, and it shone with a cold, clear, internal fire that reminded me of the new resolve in my own heart. I walked in. The showroom was silent, hushed, and opulent. A tall, impeccably dressed man approached me, his smile polite but his eyes guarded. He was assessing me, my simple but elegant new wool coat, my leather handbag, trying to determine if I was a serious client or a lost tourist. "May I help you, madam?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'd like to see the necklace in the window." His eyebrows flickered upwards in surprise, but he smoothly led me to a private viewing room. He returned a moment later with the necklace, laying it on a black velvet tray. Up close, it was even more spectacular. The light didn't just reflect off it, it seemed to be inhaled by it, fractured into 1,000 tiny rainbows, and then exhaled as a single, blinding point of brilliance. "It's a D color, internally flawless," the salesman said, his voice now a reverent whisper. "A truly exceptional stone." "It's perfect," I breathed. "I'll take it." "Great." The salesman's professional composure finally broke. A look of genuine shock crossed his face. He had expected me to ask the price, to negotiate, to consider. He had not expected an immediate, unconditional purchase. "Of course, madam," he stammered, recovering quickly. He quoted me the price. It was $65,000. It was more than 3 times what I had given Mark for his wedding. It was a sum that, a month ago, would have seemed like a cosmic joke. He didn't flinch. I simply took out the new, heavy, black credit card Robert had insisted I acquire. It was a card with no preset spending limit. I handed it to him. "I'd like to wear it, please," I said. As he was processing the transaction, his hands moving with the careful reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, the bell at the front of the showroom chimed softly. I heard voices, one a familiar, sickly sweet chirp, the other a low, imperious drawl. "We're here to look at engagement rings," Brittany's voice announced to the showroom. Something classic. But large. My back was to the door, but I went perfectly still. The salesman returned, holding the open jewelry box. He was about to fasten the necklace around my neck. "One moment," I said quietly. I stood up and turned around, just as Brittany and Margaret swept into view. They froze. The expressions on their faces were worth every single penny of the $65,000 I had just spent. It was a chaotic, beautiful collision of shock, confusion, fury, and naked, undisguised envy. They were here, in their natural habitat, a temple of wealth and luxury, and they had found me at the altar. Brittany's eyes, wide with disbelief, flickered from my face to the brilliant diamond resting on the velvet tray. Her jaw literally dropped. Margaret's face hardened into a mask of pure, icy rage. She understood immediately. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a statement. This was an act of war, fought not with legal letters, but with carrots. I turned back to the salesman, my movements calm and unhurried. "You can put it on for me now," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed silence of the showroom. I lifted my hair as he fastened the cool platinum chain around my neck. The diamond settled at the hollow of my throat, its weight a small, pleasant, powerful anchor. It felt like it had always belonged there. I looked at myself in the mirror. The diamond was a point of pure, cold fire against my skin. It was not a jewel, it was a weapon. A declaration of my own worth, worn for the world to see. I turned to face them, a serene, pleasant smile on my face. It was the same smile I had worn at the wedding, but this time, it was utterly, completely, genuine. "Margaret." "Brittany," I said, my voice warm and light. "What a surprise to see you here. Are you enjoying the city?" Margaret's lips were a thin, white line of fury. She was speechless. Brittany, however, found her voice. It was a high, reedy sound, filled with a jealousy so potent it was almost pitiable. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her eyes glued to the diamond. "How can you afford that? That money is supposed to be for Mark. For his family, good mean." "This money," I said, gently touching the diamond with the tip of one finger, "is mine. It was always mine. And I am simply choosing, for the first time, to spend it on a family member I have neglected for far too long. Myself." I smiled at them one last time, a bright, meaningless, socialite smile. I turned to the stunned salesman. "Thank you so much for your help," I said. "It's been a pleasure." Quote. And with that, I walked out of the store, the $65,000 diamond a cool, steady weight against my skin. I did not look back. I could feel their eyes on me, 2 pairs of burning, impotent holes in my back. I had not raised my voice. I had not engaged in their drama. I had simply demonstrated, in the clearest, most undeniable language they understood, the language of money, that the game had changed. I was no longer a pawn. I was the queen. And I had just made my first move. The encounter at the jewelry store was a tactical strike, a demonstration of force designed to shatter their illusions of control. I had expected it to provoke a reaction, another angry letter from their lawyers, perhaps a series of furious, sputtering phone calls. What I did not expect was the depth of their panic. The sight of me, calm and empowered, spending a fortune on myself, had done more than anger them. It had terrified them. It was tangible, glittering proof that the bank they had tried to rob was not only still solvent but was now operating under a new, formidable management that was actively spending their inheritance on diamonds. The 1-week deadline I had given Mark came and went. As expected, there was no public apology. There was only the stony, threatening silence from Margaret's legal team. It didn't matter. The chess pieces were already in motion. The rejection of my condition was, in itself, the final move I needed. It was proof of his unrepentant pride, a fact I made sure Robert Mitchell documented carefully. Then, 4 days after the deadline passed, the world tilted. I was in my penthouse, enjoying a quiet morning with a cup of tea and the Wall Street Journal, a publication I now read with a vested interest, when my phone began to buzz. It didn't just buzz once. It began a relentless, frantic series of vibrations on the marble countertop, buzzing and chiming with a stream of notifications unlike anything I had ever experienced. Texts, emails, missed calls. My fingers, still slightly stiff with morning arthritis, fumbled as I picked it up. The screen was a chaotic cascade of messages from numbers I didn't recognize, from social media platforms I barely used. And then I saw the link, sent to me by Robert. The subject line was a single, stark word: Stephanie. My heart, which had been so calm for weeks, began a low, heavy thud against my ribs. I tapped the link. It took me to Facebook, a platform I had only ever used to look at photos of my coworkers' grandchildren. A video began to play automatically. The image was grainy, poorly lit. It was Mark. He was sitting in what looked like a study, a room with dark wood bookshelves and leather-bound volumes that screamed of Margaret's curated wealth. He was not the polished, confident man from the wedding. He was a wreck. His hair was uncombed, his eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and a dark stubble shadowed his jaw. He stared at the camera for a long, agonizing moment, his chest heaving, as if he were about to be physically ill. And then he spoke. His voice was a raw, broken thing, a choked whisper that bore no resemblance to the smooth, confident tone he had used to disown me. "My name is Mark Miller," he began, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I have to apologize. I did something terrible, to my mother, my real mother." He choked on the words, a thick, guttural sob catching in his throat. I sat frozen, my tea growing cold in my hands. This was not the apology I had demanded. The one I had demanded would have been a coerced, resentful statement, a calculated business decision. This was something else entirely. This was a complete and utter unraveling. "At my wedding," he continued, his voice trembling, "I stood up, and I publicly humiliated her. I thanked my mother-in-law and called her my real mom. I did it to be cruel, to hurt her. Because I was weak, and I was a coward, and I was trying to impress people who have taught me all the wrong things." He was not reading from a script. The words were tumbling out of him, a messy, chaotic, and horrifyingly sincere confession. "Her name is Stephanie Miller. She is the only mother I have ever known. She adopted me when I was 5 years old, after my parents died. She was a single woman, working in a factory. She gave up everything for me. Everything. Her youth, her chances at a family of her own, her dreams. She worked double shifts for years to send me to a private school, to give me a life she never had. And in return, I was ashamed of her. Gone." He swiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so boyish, so familiar, it was a physical blow. I spent my entire adult life treating her like an embarrassment. An inconvenient, working-class problem I had to manage. And then I asked her for money for my wedding. $19,000. It was her entire life's savings. The money she had saved for her own funeral. And she gave it to me. Without a question. And I took it. I took my mother's funeral money to pay for flowers. He broke down then, his face collapsing into his hands as deep, racking sobs shook his entire body. The raw, unfiltered agony of it was almost unwatchable. He was not just apologizing. He was vivisecting himself, laying open the rotten core of his own character for the entire world to see. After a long moment, he looked up again, his face a mess of tears and self-loathing. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The day after the wedding, I called her from my honeymoon, and I asked for more. I wanted money for a house. And when she told me she was broke, that she had given me everything she had, I yelled at her. I told her she didn't love me. He laughed, a horrifying, humorless sound. I said that to the one person on this earth who has ever truly, unconditionally, loved me. He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes boring into the lens, as if he were trying to see me through it. Mom, Stephanie, I know you will see this. I am so sorry. I'm sorry for being a terrible son. I'm sorry for treating you like a bank. I'm sorry for breaking your heart. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve anything from you. I just needed the world to know the truth. I am a monster. And you are a saint. And I am so sorry. The video ended abruptly. The screen went black. I sat in the silence of my penthouse, my body rigid, my mind reeling. My carefully orchestrated war had just been derailed by the one weapon I had never anticipated. My son's complete and total implosion. The video went viral with a speed that was terrifying. It exploded across Facebook, was ripped and re-uploaded to YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. News outlets picked it up. By noon, Stephanie Miller and Mark Miller apology were trending topics. The internet, in its vast, fickle, and overwhelmingly powerful judgment, had reached a verdict. Mark was condemned, a digital pariah. And I, the quiet, unknown factory worker, was canonized. I was the wronged mother, the symbol of selfless love and quiet dignity. My story, or at least the version of it Mark had confessed to, was now public property. My phone did not stop ringing. Reporters from local news stations, from national morning shows, from British tabloids, all somehow found my number. I didn't answer. I simply unplugged the landline and turned my cell phone off. The first direct contact came in the form of a flood of emails to the new foundation I had established with Robert. Donations began pouring in, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Women from all over the country, all over the world, began writing in, sharing their own stories of sacrifice, of being single mothers, of feeling invisible. My quiet, personal act of justice had inadvertently sparked a movement. The inevitable, desperate plea from Brittany arrived late that afternoon. It was a long, rambling email, a frantic symphony of panic and feigned remorse. Dearest Stephanie, it began, the salutation so false it was almost comical. I have just seen Mark's video, and my heart is simply broken. Broken for you, broken for him, broken for our family. I had no idea he was in so much pain. I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I never, ever, wanted to cause a rift between you. I have always admired your strength and your sacrifice. I see now that my family's lifestyle may have been intimidating, and for that, I am truly sorry. Mark is a good man, he lost his way. Please, don't let this one mistake destroy everything. We can fix this. We are family. Please, call me. We love you. I read the email twice. It was a transparent, pathetic attempt at damage control. There was no real apology, only a series of carefully worded deflections. She was sorry if I was intimidated. She blamed Mark's pain. The only thing she was truly sorry for was that their carefully constructed world was now collapsing in a spectacular, public inferno. Her concern was not for my feelings, or even for Mark's emotional state. It was for the money. The video had not only failed to win me back, it had almost certainly guaranteed that the Lawson family name would now be associated with elder abuse and monstrous entitlement. In their world, that was a currency more valuable than cash, and it was now in freefall. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this confession was not born of a sudden, noble epiphany on Mark's part. It was an act of absolute desperation. He had seen the $65,000 diamond. He had received the letter from Robert Mitchell, a cold, legal document that made it clear I would not be intimidated. He had looked at the two paths before him, the path of pride, which led to a life of having to work and strive and build something on his own, without my safety net, and the path of utter, absolute, public self-abasement, which he clearly, desperately hoped might be his only remaining route back to my fortune. He had not chosen love over pride. He had chosen greed over pride. He had taken my ultimatum and twisted it into something far more extreme, a public spectacle of self-flagellation, hoping this grand, theatrical gesture of remorse would move me in a way a simple, coerced apology would not. He was still playing the game. He had just changed the strategy. He was still trying to manipulate me, to find the right combination of words and actions that would unlock the vault. But he had made a fatal error. He assumed that the woman who had sacrificed everything for him still existed somewhere inside me. He thought he could appeal to the mother, but the mother was gone. He had killed her at the wedding. All that was left was Stephanie. And Stephanie was not impressed by his tears. She was not moved by his public confession. She knew it for what it was, not an act of love, but the final, desperate gamble of a man who had just realized he had bet on the wrong mother, and he was about to lose everything. The digital firestorm Mark had ignited was not a thing I could control. It was a force of nature, a hurricane of public opinion that raged with an intensity I found both terrifying and, in a strange, detached way, validating. I became a reluctant celebrity, a meme, a symbol. Photos of me, sourced from Mark's now dissected social media, were plastered everywhere, a grainy picture of me at his high school graduation, looking proud and tired, a snapshot of me serving him birthday cake as a child. I was America's mom, a hashtag that trended for 3 straight days. The narrative was simple, powerful, and utterly out of my hands. I was the saint, and they were the sinners. My response to this chaos was to retreat. I did not give interviews. I did not appear on morning talk shows, despite the lucrative and insistent offers that flooded Robert Mitchell's office. I did not engage. My silence, it turned out, was more powerful than any statement I could have made. In the face of their loud, messy, public implosion, my quiet dignity became my greatest weapon. The world could project whatever narrative it wanted onto me. I was busy building a new reality. And that new reality was in California. Chicago, the city of my entire 70 years, had become a cage. It was a city of ghosts, the ghost of my father, the ghost of my younger self working on the factory line, and the ghost of the boy I had loved so fiercely. The penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, which had been my fortress, now felt like a very luxurious prison. Reporters camped outside the building. Paparazzi, a concept so alien to my life it felt like a joke, would try to snap my picture when I attempted to go for a walk. I was a prisoner of a story I had not written. So I vanished. With Robert's efficient, discreet help, I sold the penthouse. The sale was finalized in a week, a quiet, off-market transaction to a tech billionaire who valued privacy as much as I now did. I packed 3 suitcases, my father's armchair, and the box of Mark's childhood drawings, and I flew to San Diego. I had never been to California. I had only ever seen the Pacific Ocean in movies. I bought a small, beautiful house in La Jolla, a single-story home with a terracotta roof and a sprawling garden filled with bougainvillea and birds of paradise. It had a view of the ocean, a calm, endless expanse of blue that soothed the ragged edges of my soul. Here, I was anonymous. I was just another retiree in a sensible sun hat, walking along the coastline, feeling the warm sand under my feet. The ocean breeze was a balm, carrying away the last lingering scent of factory smoke and betrayal. I was no longer Stephanie Miller, America's mom. I was just Stephanie, and it was more than enough. My new life was quiet, but it was not empty. My charitable foundation, now flush with unexpected donations from strangers moved by my story, became my full-time occupation. I named it Brave Mothers. I rented a small office space in the village and hired a small, dedicated staff. We worked to provide grants for childcare, scholarships for continuing education, and emergency funding for single, adoptive mothers who found themselves in crisis. Every woman who walked through our doors had a story of sacrifice. Every check I signed felt like an act of quiet, radical justice. I was taking the legacy my father had left me and transforming it into a safety net for women who had never had one. My pain was being alchemized into purpose. Meanwhile, back in the world I had left behind, the consequences of Mark's viral confession were cascading through the lives of those who had wronged me. The internet, having canonized me, was now methodically destroying them. Margaret Lawson's business empire, built on a carefully cultivated reputation of Texas charm and ruthless efficiency, began to crumble. She became a pariah in Dallas society. Business deals mysteriously fell through. Longtime clients pulled their accounts. Her name was now inextricably linked with greed and cruelty. Online activists, digging into her corporate practices, unearthed a series of unsavory real estate deals and accusations of underpaying her logistics workers. The story shifted from a family drama to a corporate takedown. A woman who had spent her life cultivating an image of untouchable power was being dismantled, tweet by tweet, by the very public she had always held in contempt. For Brittany, the consequences were more social, but no less devastating. Her dreams of becoming a Dallas socialite, a queen in the making, evaporated. She was uninvited from charity galas. Her friends stopped returning her calls. She was a walking symbol of entitled cruelty, a beautiful, poisonous flower that no one wanted in their garden. And Mark lost everything. The video, which he had intended as a desperate, manipulative ploy to win back my fortune, cost him his career. He was a wealth manager at a prestigious Dallas firm, a job Margaret had secured for him. His clients were the city's old money elite. They did not appreciate their finances being handled by a man who had become a national symbol of ungratefulness and monstrous entitlement. He was fired within a week of the video going viral, the firm citing a violation of their code of conduct. Their dream house, the one they had called me to finance, was now an impossible fantasy. I learned through Robert that they were forced to sell their upscale Dallas condo at a loss and move into a small, rented apartment in a less fashionable suburb. The perfect, polished life they had built on a foundation of my money and Margaret's influence had been a house of cards, and the viral video was the gale force wind that had blown it all away. Their desperation, inevitably, led them to the courts. 6 months after I moved to San Diego, I was served with a lawsuit. It was a frivolous, ugly thing, a legal Hail Mary born of pure, unadulterated greed. Mark contested my new will. His lawyers, funded by the last dregs of Margaret's dwindling resources, argued that I had been of unsound mind when I wrote him out. They claimed he had been my sole heir for decades and that my sudden change of heart was evidence of my cognitive decline and susceptibility to the undue influence of my attorney. They were trying to have me declared legally incompetent. They were trying to seize control of the very fortune they had driven me to protect. I had to fly back to Chicago for the deposition. It was the first time I had seen him since that day in my penthouse. The man who sat across the legal conference table from me was a stranger. He had lost weight. His eyes were hollow, filled with a resentment so deep it was almost black. He refused to look at me, staring at his hands as his lawyer spun a fiction about my supposed senility. Brittany and Margaret were not there. They were letting him fight this final, ugly battle alone. When it was my turn to speak, I did not tremble. I did not raise my voice. I simply, calmly, and with the full, documented evidence provided by Robert and the private investigator I had hired months ago, laid out the truth. I spoke of the wedding. I spoke of the $19,000. I presented the threatening letter from Margaret's attorney. And I presented Mark's own viral video as Exhibit A. My son's lawyers claim I am of unsound mind, I said, looking directly at the judge. I would argue that my decision to protect my assets from a man who publicly confessed to seeing me as a bank, and whose mother-in-law formally threatened me when that bank was closed, is the sanest decision I have made in my entire adult life. The court sided with me. The case was dismissed in less than an hour, the judges ruling a scathing indictment of its frivolous and predatory nature. As the bailiff called for the next case, Mark finally looked at me. His eyes were not filled with remorse. They were filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a thwarted thief for the person whose locks had held. In his mind, I had not protected my assets. I had stolen his future. I walked out of the courtroom and did not look back. I flew back to my home in La Jolla that evening, the last legal tie to my son finally, mercifully, severed. As the plane ascended, leaving the glittering grid of Chicago behind, I felt the last, heavy chains of the past fall away. I had survived, I had fought back. And I had won. I arrived home to find the bougainvillea in my garden in full, glorious bloom, a riot of pink and purple against the setting sun. I stood on my patio, breathing in the salt-sweet air of the Pacific, a free woman. I had my home, I had my purpose. I had my financial peace. The world they had tried to destroy had been replaced by one of my own making, a world that was quieter, saner, and infinitely more beautiful. And in that world, I owed them nothing. Not my money, not my time, and certainly not my forgiveness. A year passed. It was a year defined not by drama, but by a quiet, steady, and profound accretion of peace. The seasons in Southern California did not change with the brutal, dramatic shifts of the Midwest, but in subtle, gentle ways. The jacaranda trees bloomed in a haze of purple in the spring, and the winter brought cool, clear nights where the stars over the Pacific seemed close enough to touch. My life began to follow these softer rhythms. The hard, jagged edges of my past began to smooth over, weathered not by forgiveness, but by the healing salt air of a new life. I was no longer in survival mode. I was thriving. My days took on a shape of my own design, a luxury I had never before known. I woke with the sun, not with an alarm clock. I would take my coffee out to the patio and watch the hummingbirds dart among the bougainvillea, their iridescent bodies a blur of motion against the deep blue of the morning sky. I took up painting, something I had idly dreamed of decades ago but had dismissed as a frivolous indulgence. I started with watercolors of the ocean, clumsy at first, but slowly, my hand steadied. I found a surprising joy in the simple act of mixing colors, of trying to capture the precise shade of the sea at dusk, the pale gold of the sand in the late afternoon sun. My small house began to fill with my own creations, bright, imperfect canvases that were a testament not to great talent, but to a life finally being lived for its own sake. My work with the Brave Mothers Foundation was the steady, anchoring rhythm of my week. We were no longer a fledgling charity running on a wave of viral outrage. We were a serious, established organization. We secured a larger office, hired 2 more caseworkers, and expanded our services, offering legal aid and job training. The women I met through the foundation were a revelation. They were tough, resilient, and fiercely loving. They were women who, like me, had put their children first, often at great personal cost. But unlike me, they had not been broken by their sacrifices. In their company, I found not pity, but a profound sense of camaraderie. We were a tribe, a quiet army of women who had built families out of pure, unadulterated will. They did not know the specifics of my story, only that I was the founder, the quiet, well-dressed older woman who listened to their stories with an unnerving, empathetic intensity. They valued me not for the money I had, but for the understanding I offered. For the first time in my life, I had friends. Real friends. Women who saw me, Stephanie, not a function, not a resource, not a mother. Just me. The silence from my former life was absolute. After the failed lawsuit, it was as if Mark, Brittany, and Margaret had ceased to exist. They had been erased from the national conversation as quickly as they had appeared. Their 15 minutes of infamous fame expired. Occasionally, a morbid curiosity would lead me to search their names online. The digital footprint of their downfall was stark and brutal. Margaret's companies had been sold off for parts, her name a permanent stain in the Dallas business community. Brittany's social media accounts had gone dark, her dreams of socialite stardom reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Mark seemed to have simply vanished. There was no new job, no new life. Only the lingering, toxic ghost of his viral confession, a digital scarlet letter he would likely wear for the rest of his days. I felt nothing when I read these updates. No satisfaction, no pity, just a profound and final sense of detachment. Their lives were their own creation. I was no longer a character in their story. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. It was not a bill or a foundation document. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope, addressed to me in a familiar, slightly messy handwriting I had not seen on paper in over a decade. There was no return address, but I didn't need one. My heart, which I had thought was now immune to such things, gave a single, hard, painful thump against my ribs. I took the letter out to the patio. The afternoon sun was warm on my shoulders. I sat in my father's armchair, which I had positioned to have the best view of the ocean, and I stared at the envelope for a long time. A part of me wanted to burn it, to throw it into the sea, to not allow this ghost to re-enter the sanctuary I had so carefully built. But another part, the part that knew this story needed a final, quiet closing of the door, knew I had to read it. My hands were steady as I opened it. The letter inside was written on simple, lined notebook paper. It was from Mark. "Mom," it began. The word, once so weaponized, now looked small, humble, and deeply sad on the page. "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't deserve for you to read this. I am not writing to ask for your forgiveness. I know that's impossible. I am not writing to ask for money. I am writing because my therapist said I should. He said I need to take accountability, not for what I hope to get, but for what I have done. I have spent the last year in a very dark place. I lost everything. My job, my wife Brittany left me 6 months ago, my place in the world. And for a long time, I blamed you. I told myself you were cruel, that you had destroyed my life out of spite. It was easier to hate you than to look at myself. But in therapy, I've had to look. And what I've seen is ugly. You didn't destroy my life. You built it, and I was the one who took a sledgehammer to the foundation. I was a weak, entitled, and deeply insecure man. I let Brittany and her mother convince me that your love, your sacrifice, was something to be ashamed of. I wanted their world so badly that I was willing to sell my own soul to get it. I see that now. That video, I'm so ashamed. I didn't do it because I was sorry then. I did it because I was desperate. I saw that necklace, and I realized I had lost control, and I thought a grand, pathetic gesture of remorse was my last chance to get the money. It was just another manipulation, another transaction. I am so sorry for that. I am sorry for everything. I am working now, at a warehouse, packing boxes. It's hard work. My hands hurt at the end of the day, and for the first time in my life, I understand, in a very small way, what you did for me, every day, for 40 years. I finally understand what a sacrifice looks like. And I am so deeply sorry that I never saw it before. I don't expect a reply. I don't expect anything from you, ever again. I just needed you to know that I finally understand. I hope you are happy. I hope you have found peace. Your son, Mark. I finished the letter and folded it carefully, my movements slow and deliberate. Tears were streaming down my face. But they were not tears of sorrow or renewed affection. They were tears of mourning. I was mourning the boy he could have been. I was mourning the mother I had once been. I was mourning the simple, uncomplicated love that had been poisoned, not by one single act, but by 1,000 small choices, a long, slow erosion of gratitude and decency. The letter was, I believed, sincere. He was finally learning the lessons I had tried, and failed, to teach him. He was finally, at the age of 48, beginning to grow up, but it was too late. The chasm between us was not a misunderstanding to be bridged by a letter. It was a geological feature, carved out by years of neglect and betrayal. You cannot unbreak a heart. You cannot unsay the words that were said. You cannot unlive the life that was stolen. I took the letter and I placed it inside the old, dusty box with his childhood drawings. I would keep it. It would be the final document in the archives of my former life. A record of a debt finally, belatedly, acknowledged. But I would not reply. To reply would be to open a door that I had fought so hard to close. My peace was too new, too precious, to risk on the hope that he had truly, fundamentally changed. Some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. They can only be survived. That evening, I walked down to the beach to watch the sunset. The sky was a riot of orange and pink and deep, bruised purple. The waves washed onto the shore with a steady, rhythmic sigh, pulling the old day away, leaving the sand clean and new for the morning. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The shock of the initial betrayal. The cold, clarifying fury of my awakening. The quiet, methodical precision of my retaliation. And finally, the profound, soul-deep peace of my liberation. I touched the diamond necklace that I now wore often, a simple, beautiful reminder. Its cool fire against my skin was a comfort. It was a symbol not of wealth, but of self-worth. It took me 70 years to learn that loving oneself is not a selfish act. It is an act of survival. The last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, and the first star of the evening appeared, a tiny, brilliant point of light in the deepening twilight. I stood there for a long time, alone but not lonely, the cool Pacific breeze on my face. I had lost a son, but I had found myself. And in the end, it was a worthy exchange. This story is a powerful reminder that love should never demand the sacrifice of self-respect. Stephanie's journey from a selfless, invisible mother to an empowered woman illustrates a vital truth. Kindness without boundaries is self-destruction. For decades, her sacrifices were mistaken for an endless resource and her silence for acceptance. Her awakening demonstrates that setting boundaries is not an act of revenge, but an essential act of survival. True liberation is found not in the approval of others, but in reclaiming your own power, recognizing that your worth is not defined by your utility. Self-love isn't selfish, it is the foundation upon which a life of genuine peace and dignity is built. Now, if you liked this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.